The movie opens up with a summary of what has happened in the prior two movies, which I thought was really nice. If you haven't watched them in chronological order in recent times, kind of gets you up to speed as far as where we are and what has happened in the past. So you have a little bit of an understanding of what's going on or what you might see coming up. So when the movie starts, we see where the ape camp is under attack. We see a group of soldiers who are doing their recon, and they've gotten close to the ape compound where they're living, their settlement, and they're radioing into Colonel McConnell to let him know that they found the spot and, let him know where it's located. And so they attack the apes, and there's carnage because there's a lot of the soldiers have died, and there's a large amount of apes who have suffered as well. And in defending their community, there was a huge loss of life. So the only two that were remaining of the soldiers, they were brought up as, I guess essentially a prisoner of war, but not really, because Caesar ended up letting them leave. But anyway, so he brings them up, and one of the guys recognized him. Oh, so it's you, and we thought, they say that your camp was this place. We couldn't find it, so we thought maybe you had died or whatever. And one of the guys was like, he's gonna kill us anyway, just kill us or whatever. And there was also Red, which is a huge ape that has a reddish colored coat, and he had flipped sides because he's now working with the military in that battalion that is coming with Colonel McCullough. So he's flipped sides, and of course he's there saying they're gonna kill you all or whatever, and he's kind of doesn't show any remorse at all that now he's flipped sides, and knowing what he knows, that there's going to be a huge attack coming, and the vengeance that Colonel McCullough has for the ape community, he shows like no remorse. And so when he said something slick, one of the apes kind of gave him a little something, and they took him off, like get him out of our sights or whatever. So anyway, Caesar, he has a little soft heart at times, and so he sent the two soldiers who were left, he sent them back, and one of the other apes wasn't really in agreement with this, because he killed off all our people. How can you just let him go? And you should send a message. And Caesar was like, well, this is the message. I'm sending this message back. His people are alive because I don't want war. Well, of course, in wartime, sometimes a good deed doesn't really get you anywhere, which is kind of the case here, because after they went back, after they left, and I don't know if I can't recall if I know when they first did the attack that they had communicated via their radios that they found the spot or whatever. So I feel like they had given the location then, but even after that, Caesar has let those two soldiers go. We see where later on that they're in their settlement, it's nighttime, and Caesar hears something, and their community that they have is well hidden, and I see why they couldn't find them, because their community is under a waterfall, and so there's a huge opening in the side of the rock. It looks like a rock because the water's coming out in front of it. And so they have huge living areas in there and tunnels and whatnot. So that's why they couldn't find them, because if you're looking, you can't come in through the back. You have to rappel down the front of the waterfall to come inside. And so now we see where Colonel McConnell, here he comes. McCullough, I keep calling him McConnell. Forgive me with this name. And so here he comes, and so there ends up being a confrontation between him and the apes, and of course he has weapons, and so there's a loss of lives again for the apes, and now this time Caesar loses, his wife, and Blue Eyes, his son, ended up dying. So now he's really enraged. So we see where he's going. He decides he's going to leave the camp. He's going to go out, and he's going to have to find this guy and he's gonna have to get to him before they come and kill everybody in the community. He feels like this is the only way, instead of waiting for them to attack and kill everybody. And so when he's about to leave, there's a couple of his his right-hand men or leaders in the ape community who were coming in from their recon, and they said, he said, you don't want to come, I don't want any more loss of lives. And they were like, we want to come because we don't want you to lose your life. So they ended up going with him. But prior to this, let me backtrack a little bit. Prior to this attack now, we saw where Blue Eyes and Rocket, one of the pro-Caesar apes and one of the leaders in the community, had gone out scouting, and they said they found this place that was a desert and there's a lake by it or whatever. They need to find a new settlement. And so they want Winter, who's the ape with the white color, he wanted them to get moving right away. And so he was kind of disgruntled because Caesar says, no, we can't do this right away. We need, there needs to be planning. And so he's kind of more impulsive. And because he didn't get the answer that he wanted, that kind of causes friction as well. We'll see later the result of that, because I guess, he didn't like how Caesar was going. So there continues to be fracturing in their community with the other male apes, because they're feeling like they don't like the way Caesar does things, and ultimately he would never be able to please everybody because everybody has a different way that they feel like things need to happen. So anyway, he was upset about that, but it seemed like he had calmed down. But little do we know, there's other things that he's going to be doing that is stemming from this, it seems to me anyway. So after Caesar leaves with his crew of guys, I think it was like 3 other apes. It was Rocket and I think Luca and Caesar. I think it was 3 of them. Okay, forgive me if I missed one of them. So we see where it's winter time and they're going across a huge expanse to get somewhere. And this place that they were gonna do recon on was Colonel McCullough's place, where he's building, he's got this huge, used to be a weapons depot, I think. It's a huge facility. And so as they're, we see the building in sight and they're going towards it, they saw some men in the snow. And we see where they're, it looks like they've been killed. And so when Caesar was asking, like, what's the matter? Who did this? The guy tried to talk and he couldn't. So they figure something is going on why he would be killing his own men. Now, before they got to these guys who were killed by, the military, they had come upon this house that had this guy. He had some, bundle of wood in his hand, and they came up on hand. They didn't know who was there, so he was like, I'm putting this down. And of course, one of the apes gunned him down, which I was surprised by, because he didn't have a weapon or anything. So I feel like maybe either they were just jittery, or there is just some level of exponential hate for humans that kind of took out on this guy. But I was kind of sad to see that, because he was kind of innocent as far as we know. So when they went into the house to clear it, they found this little girl, and so the girl couldn't speak. Oh yeah, this was after, because I remember one of the apes saying she can't talk like the other guy, or the other way around. Oh my goodness. So anyway, she couldn't talk, and we find out later that the reason she couldn't talk is because that the simian flu had mutated, and it was causing that those who had the virus before, or had exposure to the virus, that's in their system, the people who were alive were immune to that. And so even though they have the virus in their system, it didn't cause the huge, the death and whatnot that it caused in the other people. But because it's in their system now and it's mutating, it's causing humans to devolve to the point where they're essentially being like apes now, where they can't talk, and the logical the higher level of thinking is no longer present. So, this is something that's happening now, and this is causing Colonel McCollough now to be even more, I guess, crazy, or a sense of urgency, or more, what's the word that I'm looking for? He's more motivated than ever in his mission, because he hates the apes. He feels like they're the reason why this is all happening, although they're kind of innocent. They were being tested on. They're not the reason this has happened, but he hates them. And also we find out later that his son was killed because of the simian flu, and so he had this pent-up hatred that he was taking out on the apes. And because of his fear for devolving, now he really feels like he's got to get rid of them as well. But before he does, or before anything else, he feels like he could use them for something. And so while Caesar and his men are going, or his apes are going to the compound, by the time they made it there, they found out that the military, and when I say the military, I'm talking about McCullough and his crew of people, had gotten back to their compound and have corralled all the apes. And so now all the apes are in captivity. And when they came and they went around to higher ground to look down to see what was happening, they realized that Colonel McCullough was running, I guess, a slave camp, or what do they call it? A labor camp. Because now the apes are there working, and they're being mistreated. They're not being fed. They're long hours. They're being caged, and they're in chains. And all because he wants to build a fortress for whenever the military comes. He was saying that there's some battalion from up north who is supposed to be coming down to help them fight. And so he has this slave labor to fortify the compound that he was at. And so the slaves who were there, the apes who were being enslaved, were there. And he later found out that the stuff is happening closer to home, because when he got there, he realized that his son, his youngest son Cornelius, whom he had left with Lake, he was now in the encampment. So now he really he just feels like, I probably made this worse. I lost my husband, my wife, and my son, and then now my son is in captivity. And so, later, as they were doing their recon, he ended up being captured. And yeah, so now the whole ape community is it just seemed like there was just no hope. Caesar was tortured, and at one point he was brought into Colonel McCullough's office, and he kind of, I guess bragging in a sense, and he was asking him how he know what he knows, because Caesar had figured out that there was no division coming from the north. It was just all him. And he was like, oh, well, that's impressive. And of course he's been snarky with veiled threats and whatnot to him. And then he was eventually thrown into captivity. He was in one of the cages, and he was, getting hard labor just like the rest of them, and then at one point when he stood up for the apes, like, apes need food and water, he was like, well, basically, I don't care. And he was adamant, like, listen, apes need food and water. And so he was like, well, you still got to work, and I don't care. So when Caesar was adamant about them being fed, at least, to be doing all this labor, I mean, they were carrying some heavy boulders, they were logs that they were carrying, they were worked really hard, and he wasn't feeding them. And so, there was an altercation before that where he had killed another ape, and then when Caesar stood up, he put a gun to another one. He was going to kill them unless they got back to work. And so this lady, female ape, started picking up this big old boulder. I mean, the boulder was almost bigger than her that she was picking up, just because she wanted to avoid another ape being killed. And so, of course, him standing up and trying to fight for their rights didn't really work out, because, you have to try to backtrack now and step back to be able to save more death and more carnage in the community. Now, before he made it back to this compound that Colonel McCullough had, they had picked up an ape that wasn't from their community. I'm not quite sure that I figured out where he came from, but he was able to speak like Caesar, but it didn't seem he didn't come off as intelligent as the other apes who were in the lab. But he could speak, and he had a higher level of intelligence than the regular apes. And so they had come upon him on their way when they're trekking across to come to this compound, and he offered a jacket to the little girl. Now the little girl doesn't speak, so we don't know his name. But this ape, I'm gonna call him No Name Ape because I don't think there was ever a name for him. And he was asking about the little girl, where the girl came from, asking Caesar if he had kids and whatnot. And he had given, this kind of made me chuckle because it was a kind gesture, but it was crazy how it was just a little bit of nothing. But he had given the little girl a gift, and the gift was an emblem from a Chevy Nova, and it said Nova in the front. And she cherished it so much, she went to sleep. And she had the little emblem by her head or by her face. She's holding on to it. And it was just a nice, sweet little gesture in here. I was like, aw, poor kid. But it was a nice gesture nonetheless. And at one point we see where, what was this ape? One of the apes who were traveling with Caesar, he took a liking to the little girl. And we see where, they came by, it looks like a Japanese cherry tree, if you can believe, that's out there in the snow in the middle of nowhere, and he picked down a little stem of flowers and put it behind her ear, and he just really seemed to have been taking a liking to this little girl. Now Maurice was there. Yeah, that's the person who was missing. Maurice was there along with the trek as well, and he was the reason why they ended up picking up this little girl, because when they were trying to take off, where her guardian was killed, Maurice was like, no, but you can't leave her by herself, she has no one. And so he convinced Maurice to pick up the little girl, which was crazy that you have a little girl traveling with a bunch of apes. For sure, if anybody ever saw this, they would assume that the apes had kidnapped this little girl, and it would have been all out war just for that. But Maurice is so compassionate. He has such a soft heart that he was like, oh, we can't leave her there. So, but the girl we find out later that when she asked Maurice if, what am I, or am I you, or something, because she doesn't speak, so they're trying to communicate between each other, and I think she was asking if she's an ape too, but Maurice told her, he took the piece, the little emblem on her jacket, and he said, you, Nova. And so from then on, her name became Nova, and she was happy that, she liked, I don't know if she liked the name, or she was just happy that she had an identity, which was very cool. But shortly after he had given Nova the flower put behind her ear, shortly after that, after they were doing some recon, he ended up being captured and tortured, and he ended up dying. And so we see a very emotional moment here, and they almost had me crying too, because he was there, he was dying, and of course, because he was developing a bond with Nova. Nova was crying, and she ended up putting the flower behind his ear, just like he did for her. And she was crying, very emotional and distraught about the whole thing. And it was just so sad to see. So they lost him. And then when they first arrived at the camp, we realized that Winter, the ape who had the white coat, and the one who was kind of wanting to leave right away, and I don't know what happened, and I didn't realize that he was so distraught or so anti-Caesar, or of course, in a group you're gonna have disagreements, but I didn't think it was to the extent where he kind of defected. We found him with Colonel McCullough's crew, and so when the other apes came and found him, they kind of, tried to shut him up so he didn't, bring attention to them, and they ended up, killing him because he was a traitor, and of course, if they couldn't leave him alive because he was going to run and tell, because he was working for them now, which, he was like, well, Red told me that the colonel was, the colonel would save me or something about the colonel. He was pretty much recruited by Red because he was scared of dying. And of course, when you hear about, they're gonna kill off all the apes, I guess I can kind of see why he kind of turned, but against his own people, that's kind of sad. And I can see both sides. It was kind of sad to see him die, and he was so fearful and tearful, and he was remorseful about, having switched sides. But of course, what could they have done? So he ended up dying as well in this movie because of being a traitor, I suppose. So after Caesar got captured, we see where he is, after the whole debacle about the food and all that, he was beaten and tortured, and of course the Big Red was one of those who was imposing. It was almost like slavery all over again in the movie, because you had your own people torturing your own people for somebody else. We had an ape who was meting out punishment and was, all for torturing his own people, starving them, working them to death, and just didn't care. So at one point when Caesar was in his cage, we see where Nova came out, and he was like, checking on him. He was thirsty, he had no food. Of course, he wasn't getting any food. He was being tortured, and so she brought him some water, and pushed it was like a basin, what was a bucket, and so he helped her. She helped him get some water, and then when they saw Nova was out there, she even threw her little stuffed animal in there to comfort him, which was so sweet. I'm like, oh, this made me want to cry again. And so the other apes were on the other side. You can see their cages across the way. I think they had two sides of cells or cages, and then there's a walkway in between. So they're facing each other. And so the apes kind of tried to get her attention, and they, put a handful of grain in her hand. So she pushed her hand through, and they put it in here to give to him so he could have some food. And that was just so selfless, because they themselves were starving too. It's not like they're getting a bunch of food that they can have leftovers from. But they were sacrificing so he could have something, because they know he was being tortured, he hadn't been fed. And so she brought it over there and poured it in his hand. And then, of course, they came, one of the other apes, shortly after that incident happened, we saw where the soldiers were coming out, and to prevent them from catching her, one of the apes came out in the open to be captured so that she could escape. And that was another thing, and we see where after that they were working on, the ape with no name, he accidentally discovered an underground tunnel under the place, because at one point when they were trying to get out of the line of sight, he backed up behind a rock, and then he fell into it looked like it was a wooded ground area, and that was rotted, and he fell through. And then they discovered that they were those tunnels underneath, and so they decided to use that to their advantage, and that's how they were able to get kind of a little bit of an upper hand over the military guys, because once they went through there, they realized that it ran under where that walkway was between the cages, and so they were able to, we see at one point where the no-name ape peeped his head up, because he was able to get a hole in the ground. It seemed like the ground was really soft, and somehow I'm not wrapping my mind around that well either, because if the ground was so soft, why couldn't somebody have fallen through before? So it didn't take a whole lot for them to get a hole into the ceilings from the tunnel. And so at one point we see where they pulled this guy through that. He was about to kill one of the apes, and so they were able to start it, kind of, a domino effect, because once they were able to get him some sustenance, he was able to re-energize a little bit, and he was ready to fight. After he ate, he got the food, and we looked across, we see one ape started putting his hand up. It was a sign, and they started doing the same sign, like, to kind of illustrate or give him encourage him, and also to show him support and that they believe in him. And so from there, the war was on against the military, and they wanted to overtake them and save themselves. So we see where the guys, there's all out, I guess, another round of ape versus men here. There's a whole fighting scene. Big Red was a part of it too. Of course, he never left the military site. He was a traitor till the end. So there's a fight scene, all out fight with the apes against the humans and all that. And there's explosions and all this stuff happened. And those military guys who were there, we see at one point that they were running to leave because there's a huge explosion and most of the, a lot of damage to the place. And after that happened, we see where Caesar had gone up to when all the fighting was going on, and he had gone up to where McConnell had his place. McCollough, I don't know why I call him McConnell, sorry about that. And we see where he seemed to have been sick because he was bleeding out his nose, and I was like, what is happening here? So apparently, the simian flu was at it again, and he, I think Caesar had pulled a gun, and he was going to kill him, and he was pulling the gun to his head. He wanted Caesar to kill him, but Caesar, I'm like, don't do it, don't let him get out of it this easily, because you need to live with all the stuff that you have done. And in the end, Caesar didn't do it. He was like, basically, kill your own self. I'm not gonna let you get out of it this easily. But ultimately, we see towards the end of the movie that there was a huge avalanche coming after Caesar was able to save a large majority of the apes, and he was able to get away from there. We saw him come up through the tunnels and back up on a higher elevation that was overlooking the compound where they were doing their recon earlier. And there we see a huge avalanche coming down the mountain. It's like, oh my goodness, there's no way to escape this. But of course, where they were, just like in that park that he used to go to when he was little, there were some giant, I don't know what kind of trees they were. They were super tall. And of course, they're monkeys, so they can climb those trees. And so we see where people are running here, there, and everywhere. But the avalanche was so massive that it just kind of leveled the whole compound. Anybody who was there pretty much died. It covered the whole scene. You couldn't even see the buildings or anything after that avalanche came through. But of course, the apes were able to escape because they were able to climb up those giant trees and hang on for dear life. So in the end, only the apes survive. Which was, I'm just like, yes, thank the Lord. I'm happy to see that they were able to make it out and majority of their community intact, because really, they never wanted this war. They never did anything to, well, of course there's bad apples, but for the most part, most of the ape community wanted peace. So I feel like this one was much better than the Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, because there was so much. There was some action in the other one, but there's a lot of action in this one. I feel like this one had more emotional elements to this, because I think I almost cried like 2 or 3 times in this one. I got kind of, teary-eyed with this connection between the apes and the humans, and even among themselves, the selflessness, and them, they just want peace. They're really just defending themselves, and it's kind of sad that they couldn't really exist in peace, or humans and the apes couldn't exist in peace. And it was just kind of sad that they lost a huge population, a huge portion of their community, just because Colonel McCullough wanted revenge and all that. So it was kind of sad, but at the same time, this is a really good movie. I enjoyed it, but let me know what you think if you've seen this one. Until next time.